Okay then. Welcome everybody to Club EvMed. We are really happy that you're here. My name is Lucas Blumlich. I'm from the Brazilian Evolution and Health Study Group from the University of São Paulo. And our goal in Club EvMed is to connect the evolutionary medicine community and share exciting new research. Club EvMed is organized by the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health, and also by 10 other evolutionary medicine centers and programs. Johnny will paste all the information in the chat. Thank you very much for coming, and we'd like to ask you to participate in the conversation. We try to keep these conversations as informal as possible, and you can post questions in the chat during the presentation, and we can discuss everything after Dr. Cari presents. You can also raise your hand to ask a question virtually, of course. This is a part of a series on talks titled Bringing New Rigor to Understand and Investigate Evolutionary Mismatch. And today we have Dr. Cari Goetz with a talk titled Studying Evolutionary Mismatch, Insights from Human Mating Research. Dr. Goetz is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at California State University, San Bernardino. She uses an evolutionary lens to study human mating strategies and related behavior and in psychology, including mate preferences, attraction, mate value discrepancies, relationship satisfaction. Her work spans from empirical studies documenting novel cues to short-term mate attractiveness to theoretical articles on the evolution of long-term mating in humans. Currently, she's interested in studying how evolutionary mismatch affects mating cognition and behavior. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for that introduction. I will go ahead and share my screen and make sure that everybody can see. I think we're good there. Okay, yeah. Okay, we're good. Okay, cool. So thank you for inviting me to speak here today. For the past few years, I've been really interested in thinking about the idea of evolutionary mismatch, particularly as it pertains to human mating psychology. I know this is an intellectually diverse group, so I hope that the insights I've had thinking about this in my own area of study will either generalize to other areas or spark new insights relevant to your work. I'm really looking forward to discussing all of this with you. So I'd like to start with sharing with you my model of the mind and the perspective I come from in my work. I think of the mind as composed of numerous functionally specialized information processing devices or psychological adaptations. I use the term psychological mechanism interchangeably with that idea, designed by evolution by natural selection. And I focus my research on trying to understand the adaptations that function in the domain of human mating. I've studied a number of mating-related topics, including cues to sexual exploitability and how such cues may trigger sexual attraction in some men. I studied age-related changes in women's sexual desires, how mate preferences relate to friend preferences, what motivates people to abandon a current mate for a new one, and how mate value discrepancies predict emotions within a relationship, things like relationship satisfaction, anger, and shame. I can show you a concrete example here of how I specifically think about psychological adaptations and how to study them with some of the work that I conducted with Dan Conroy Beam and David Buss. We wrote a paper in which we used evolutionary game theory to argue that long-term relationships could be modeled as public goods games, and thinking about partners as standing to gain greater fitness benefits by pooling their investments into the relationship. That initial premise set us up to hypothesize about different selection pressures that initially favored long-term mating in humans, and then the selection pressures that arose once long-term mating existed and was a thing. And then that set us up to hypothesize about the psychological machinery that may have evolved in response to those selection pressures. So this framework led to us hypothesizing about relationship satisfaction as an adaptation. The image that I've got on the slide details how a satisfaction adaptation could function to motivate fitness beneficial behavior in a relationship. You can see on the top, there's information such as the costs and benefits of the current relationship, how easily you could increase investment from your partner, and the costs that would be associated with outward display of relationship dysfunction. We thought of those as potential input into the adaptation. A functional satisfaction adaptation would then use this information to toggle the feeling of relationship satisfaction and motivate adaptive behavior, which could include leaving the relationship, engaging in an affair, or on the flip side, actions to encourage a partner to stay and dissuade them from leaving. This hypothesizing about relationship satisfaction as an adaptation led to some cool empirical work, where we demonstrated that people who are higher in mate value than their partner, so people who are more desirable to others as a potential mate than their partner is, they experience decreasing relationship satisfaction the more alternative options there are that they find more attractive than their current partner. I'm not really here today to talk about these different lines of work, but this gives you a general introduction to my model of the mind. So I hypothesize about the design features of psychological adaptations by thinking about the selection pressures that shaped those adaptations. And by design features, I mean the sort of information that the adaptation takes in as input, how that adaptation processes that information, and what kinds of functional output that adaptation could produce, including specific behaviors, conscious thoughts people have, and their feelings. Then I designed studies to try to test for the presence of these design features generally by observing if people's behavior and cognition follows the logic of the adaptation as hypothesized. So an underlying assumption of my work has been that I could, reveal the design of our psychological adaptations regardless of the context in which I was observing them, right? You could think of an analogy maybe of seeing a grounded airplane, where you could imagine somebody who's never seen an airplane or never heard of an airplane coming across one lying dormant, let's say nowhere near an airport, nowhere near other planes, right? And you could imagine that through the study of the different features of the plane, a person might be able to figure out that the plane is for flying, and that's the function of the plane. Even if they've never seen it in air, even if they've never seen it in the context in which it was designed to operate. On the other hand, you could also imagine a circumstance where somebody comes to the wrong conclusion about function because they're using it or seeing it or studying it out of the context in which it was designed to operate. In Disney's now classic, The Little Mermaid, Ariel, who lives under the sea, where you wouldn't need utensils to eat because your hands would always be clean, is led to believe that humans use a fork for combing their hair. The design features of the fork seem to line up with this function, and her tests confirm that the fork does a pretty good job at detangling hair. The more I'd considered the issue of observing our psychology out of the context in which it evolved, the more important this concept of evolutionary mismatch has seemed to me when doing my own work, and possibly as its own unique area of study. That we're studying people whose adaptations are operating in an environment that differs in many ways from the environments that shaped those adaptations has consequences for how those adaptations may operate. And if we aren't careful, we might draw inaccurate conclusions about the psychological adaptation's design features because of evolutionary mismatch. This includes biased inputs about the inputs or range of inputs to which an adaptation is sensitive, how that adaptation processes information, and possible outputs an adaptation could produce. We could even, just like Ariel, mischaracterize the function of an adaptation, and research then that stems from such conclusions would be really built on faulty premises. This paper on this topic, it represented a first stab at thinking about how researchers can approach studying human mating with evolutionary mismatch in mind. So most of the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on providing insights that I think are helpful, that anybody who's interested in evolutionary mismatch maybe could draw on. And many of these are described in this paper. First, I want to highlight some challenges that can make it difficult to recognize that evolutionary mismatch might be biasing our understanding of evolved psychology. So my point here, the first point, is that all people are representative of evolutionary mismatch. That's assuming you're studying anybody who exists now. they are all representative of evolutionary mismatch. The image I'm showing here is a Himba woman in traditional dress on her cell phone doing some shopping. The Himba are a semi-nomadic, they're semi-nomadic pastoralists who live in Namibia, and there's some features of their society that make them really interesting if you study some of the things that I do. Their marriages are often arranged, so kin input and control over partner choice is something that is likely to have been a feature of the process of mate selection for much of human history. However, most married adults in the Himba also have at least one boyfriend or girlfriend in addition to their spouse. And these relationships are often discussed very openly. And so that's a different feature, right, of what happens related to mate selection and how relationships operate in the Himba that is really interesting. And I bring up this example because I want to emphasize that I don't suggest that we should approach studying evolutionary mismatch by trying to compare people who are mismatched to people who aren't mismatched. I think that that's both practically impossible, and I don't think trying to do some assessment of overall degree of mismatch across people is the right approach here. But also, this is just a challenge, right? If anybody we study will be representative of evolutionary mismatch, then any sample, right, could lead to biased or inaccurate conclusions about the evolved function of behavior or how adaptations work. And it's not just that people we study are mismatched. So we're mismatched. And we're the ones who are trying then to theorize about how the process of evolution has designed psychological adaptations. And this may be hampered by the fact that evolution hasn't really shaped our minds to do this. Our psychological adaptations evolved to represent the world in ways that would have benefited us ancestrally, not necessarily accurately. And we are smart, right? We can learn things about how the world works, but we do have to overcome certain biases. So one example of that are things like essentialist beliefs about species. There's evidence, especially when people are early in learning about evolution, that it is hard for people to conceptualize the variation that you see among species because we think of a species as having essential qualities, right? So elephants, they have a trunk, right? And so actually appreciating though the variation on that trait is difficult because of how we essentialize traits about species. And there's probably some extent that to some extent we do that with humans ourselves as well. Especially, I think, in the world of evolutionary psychology, where we often talk about things like species typicality. And so that's a challenge then for us as researchers in trying to appreciate or understand what are how full is the possible range, right, of variation across lots of different traits in humans. We're also individually biased by our own developmental experiences and contexts, which could influence how we think about everything, from the questions that we think are actually important to ask to how we think about fitness costs and benefits, past or current selection pressures, what makes for adaptive behavior. Again, I bring up Ariel and her life under the sea, making it difficult for her to conceive that the fork was for eating, not for brushing your hair or combing your hair. I highlight these challenges because I think they're important for researchers to keep in mind when they are explicitly trying to study mismatch, but also when they're just studying any organism that and may be at risk of failing to take mismatch into account. So I think a more granular approach to assessing mismatch is the way to go, rather than some global assessment of degree of mismatch of people or groups of people. So my approach, and one that I've advocated for and argued for, is that an important thing for us to do is to identify the specific ways people are mismatched. And that sets you up to think about the consequences that a particular characteristic has for people's psychology, physiology, or behavior. So my colleagues and I identified these 9 characteristics as particularly important mismatch characteristics present in many of the people that we often study. You'll notice they string together as the acronym STRANGELY. Many of you may be familiar with Henrik and colleagues' concept of weird people. So that's weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Their Weirdest People in the World article from 2010 pointed out that much of our research in psychology comes from weird samples, and that weird people are quite unique when we think about the history of humanity. So I will admit, we did adjust some of our label names for these characteristics to fit into our Strangely acronym, so that we could say that much of research on human mating comes from strangely weird people. There's probably a lot more characteristics you could list when thinking about these ideas, but we selected these because we felt these would be some of the most important ones to think about when studying human mating. I suspect that many of these characteristics also will matter for other domains of research, but there might be other characteristics that we hadn't really been thinking about that would matter more for some of those other domains of research. I don't have time to give, the detailed description of every single one of these, but I want to talk through a couple of them to demonstrate how we sort of analyzed these characteristics and thought about their implications for human mating. So I'll start with the first one at the top there. S stood for social media. And really with this one, maybe even mass media before it, some of what I'm going to say probably applies there as well, but social media has taken some of what I'm going to say just to new heights. So social media really bombards people with an unprecedented amount of exposure to other people. Some of those people that they're seeing may be perceived as potential mates, even though there's really no chance that that person is a potential mate. Some of them potentially as rivals, which might have other implications for how it influences psychology. With social media, we're also provided like a pseudo intimate view into other people's relationships. I say pseudo because people really curate what they present via social media to portray themselves in ways that don't accurately reflect their real lives. But in psychology, we have that functions in something like mate search, mate selection, or functions in evaluating the quality of our current relationship might be ill-equipped to sort through this type of input. And at least with adolescents, we know that there is evidence that social media usage is associated with depression and anxiety. I think this could be a mismatch problem where people's psychology for self-comparison is tricked by social media into concluding that we're much worse off than the false lives presented on social media. Another one I want to highlight is relocatable. So when you think about many of the people, at least many of the people that I study now, the ease with which they can relocate to an entirely different place and join a totally new social group without any reputation following them is really novel from an evolutionary perspective. There's lots of possible implications for this, but one that we focused on is people's ability to engage in behavior that violates social norms or might negatively affect a person's reputation or provoke retaliation. In the world of mating, right, this could include things like mate poaching, but it also could include sexually aggressive behaviors, things like harassment and assault. The question here is, how does our mating psychology respond to cues of high relocatability, right? So you could imagine a set of hypotheses where you're thinking about men's mating adaptations as being flexibly responsive to these cues. And you might then predict higher rates of sexual aggression, right, in response to this cue. But you could also think through a set of hypotheses where you're really thinking about this as a novel circumstance and maybe women's, this puts women at greater risk from a minority of men pursuing exploitative strategies, because any psychology women have for self-protection didn't evolve to be sensitive to this cue of relocatability, right? This idea that somebody could get up and disappear and leave and not be trackable at all. There is actually some evidence in one study, women 18 to 34, that housing tenure was negatively associated with fear of rape. So the idea here is that the longer that they lived somewhere, the lower their fear of rape was. So this does suggest that women's self-protection psychology maybe is at least sensitive to being in a novel environment. But this sort of leads to another potential implication, right, in the world that many of us live in now, where people move to new environments a lot, right? Women move for school, they move for jobs to whole new places. And so to what extent are women experiencing unprecedentedly high levels of fear of rape due to a mismatch like that? I'll briefly touch on one more characteristic, lots of options. So estimates of ancestral group sizes of humans range from dozens to a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand if smaller groups are interacting. However, even if groups were on the larger end of those estimates, mating options still would have been limited to those available. So those who are also looking for a mate of your preferred sex, and also in the right age range. So this is nothing like the seemingly endless options some people have now, right? If they walk down a city street and see dozens of entirely new faces, or they open a social media app or join a dating app, right? There's some studies that have actually looked at how people's mate selection strategies vary depending on choice set size. So in one study of speed dating events, they showed that at larger events, so this is where they rotated through more potential dates at this speed dating event. At the larger events, they were actually more influenced by visible cues, things like height and weight. But at smaller events where they rotated through fewer people, they were more influenced by non-visible cues. So things like education and occupation became more important. There's another study where they weren't using an actual like meeting people scenario, but people were evaluating profiles, and this is women evaluating profiles, and they varied the number of options they had. So they either had 4 options and were picking like 1 out of 4, or they had lots of options, so 24 or 64 profiles that they were sorting through. And they asked these women what strategy they used when they were trying to make a selection. And they found that the strategies varied depending on if they were doing, making the decision out of a small group versus a much larger one. With the small group, they reported using like a weighted average strategy where they tried to evaluate each profile across all the attributes that mattered to them. But when evaluating those larger sets, they couldn't do that, right? It was too many. So they used more of an elimination by aspect strategy where they would think about one trait or characteristic, go through all the profiles and eliminate some based on just that characteristic as they went. And so you could imagine you'd end up with different choices in the end, right? Depending on which of these strategies that you're using. Other studies have also shown that people are less satisfied with their mate choice when they've been given more options to evaluate. So again, this sort of comes to these questions, right? Of how does our mating psychology respond to this mismatch characteristic? We clearly can make choices, right? When we make mating choices, when we're presented with a lot of options. So should we be thinking of these options as like a supernormal stimulus? Or are there other decision-making mechanisms that really didn't actually evolve in the context of mate selection that we're co-opting in the modern environment to try to make this decision now that we've got to make a decision when there's so many potential options? If that's the case, we want to be really careful about conclusions we're making about adaptive functioning of these strategies in our current environment, or the evolved function of those strategies, right? Or the psychology that's doing that selection. In my work, I focused on thinking about specific characteristics, but I also wanted to bring in some work done by another evolutionary psychologist, Norm Lee, and some colleagues. Uh, they they have a pretty cool paper that's thinking about evolutionary mismatch in psychology in general. And they proposed a dimensional structure for thinking through evolutionary mismatch. And they proposed 4 dimensions that I have listed here: source, type, causes, and impacts. I really think these dimensions can be useful for analyzing specific characteristics. It's something that I've done when I've thought through my characteristics, and I've kind of looked at these dimensions and seen if that, helps me think through some of the implications of how these characteristics might be affecting psychology. This slide shows 2 of the dimensions in the table there: source and type. So source distinguishes between natural causes and human-induced ones. And for the types, by forced, they mean when a new environment is imposed on an organism, while hijacked refers to when novel stimuli are favored over the stimuli the mechanism evolved to process. So in some ways, for some people, social media might be a human-induced change that is hijacking some of their mating mechanisms. Their causes dimension specifies the cause of mismatch as either changes in input, that is more or less input, so that change in intensity or input could be missing entirely, or input being replaced by novel or fake cues, or changes in the consequence of output. Like I said, their paper was about evolutionary mismatch and psychology very broadly, but some of their examples here are relevant to mating and the characteristics that I discussed, like lots of options. Finally, their consequences dimension focuses on the effect a mismatch characteristic could have on fitness or an individual's well-being, health. I think this is a cool insight about evolutionary mismatch. It isn't only cases where something novel in our environment is negatively affecting fitness or negatively affecting people's health and happiness. I think that gets a lot of attention when we think about evolutionary mismatch. But it could be the opposite, right? It could be that there's things about evolutionary mismatch that, increase fitness and also improve people's well-being, health, and happiness. Or it could be some combination of these, right? So when I think about birth control and the impact that it's had on women's choices and options, it's a nice example of mismatch that may negatively impact fitness, but positively affect health and well-being. So our analysis of our strangely weird characteristics or strangely characteristics, it led us to think through some recommendations for researchers, and these are kind of my recommendations, conclusions. And again, these were all, generated by thinking specifically about the case of human mating, but I do think a lot of these generalize to studying mismatch in other domains. First, I think we need to incorporate mismatch thinking into all of our work, even if we aren't explicitly testing mismatch hypotheses. Anyone we are studying is mismatched, and our own context and developmental environment really shaped the way that we think. So I think many researchers who are studying human physiology, cognition, behavior would benefit from purposefully adding some kind of mismatch analysis to their theorizing and maybe even to their study design. Also, I think those dimensions of mismatched identified by Lee and colleagues provide a really nice guideline for doing some of that thinking about mismatch. One of the most useful ways I think that we can incorporate mismatch thinking or start doing it is by identifying those specific characteristics, right? Get past the, oh, okay, people are mismatched in general to, well, how are they mismatched? In what ways? And how does that matter for the thing you're trying to study? And it might be that you are focusing on the characteristics that are specific to the people you study, right? Because and that's where you're coming from. Or it might be that thinking more broadly about the type of psychology or physiological mechanisms you're trying to study and how mismatch matters for those. This sets you up then to make some principled predictions about how those characteristics will affect the phenomena that you're studying. And it may be that there's some characteristics that we're more confident are representative of mismatch than others. Humans evolved under varying conditions, and the range of variation that humans have experienced in all sorts of the context they lived in and how they lived, there's a big range there. And so, deciding whether or not something is truly evolutionarily novel or not can be difficult for some things. And so I think it's okay that there's some things that we're going to be more confident about saying, yeah, this is new and novel. That seems like evolutionary mismatch versus, this is not something that we've noticed before, but maybe we've missed it because we've been limited in the samples we've studied. Or we haven't conceived of something in a certain way, but it does represent just a part of the human experience, it's not a specific example of mismatch. The big methodological recommendation here is that, once you've started thinking about these mismatch characteristics, is to do what you can to study people who vary along these characteristics. I think this is a key tool for testing mismatch hypotheses. The concern that researchers in psychology or in other disciplines don't have diverse samples, that's not a novel concern. That's something we talk about all the time. But my recommendation here about sample diversity is to think about it along the lines of mismatch characteristics. And I think that's a different insight. I think oftentimes when we think about sample diversity, there's some typical categories we look at. And thinking about these mismatch characteristics adds another layer of how to be thinking about sample diversity. This can, one, allow you to maybe test some mismatch hypotheses. Does some range on this characteristic change outcomes? But also can help defend against drawing those biased conclusions, right? Assuming the fork is for combing your hair. Because, without that sample diversity, that's how you end up assuming too much or overgeneralizing, right? What you're getting from your sample to make claims about adaptations or, the evolved nature of certain strategies that are inaccurate, and having greater sample diversity would help defend against that. I'm going to stop myself now. There's a longer version of this talk I can do, but it was, from what I've heard, this is a nice group that would love to chat and tends to have questions, and so I wanted to leave time for that. I do want to thank my colleagues at the Center for the Study of Human Nature at Cal State Fullerton and my co-authors on the paper that I was mostly talking about today. It's really conversations with them that have shaped a lot of my thoughts on these ideas, and so that has been wonderful. And I want to thank you all for listening and joining our session today. But yes, I'll stop myself to leave times for question and discussion.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So, do we have any comments? Dr. Joe Graves posted some comments on the chat. Maybe you'd like to speak a little bit?
Pull them up.
Well, I always chat. So yeah, I mean, I have one of them is that I have a real problem with the whole weird typology. Simply because what weird really means is the W is a code word for white. Then D, democratic, what exactly does that mean? Especially in the context of Western society or, industrialized society in the last couple of centuries. So, it's a problematic acronym, and I wish we would do better.
I don't disagree. I think the part of at least how I think about the characteristics is trying to think about them more specifically anyway, right? So there's the Western is code for white, but also Western also is really vague and nebulous too, right? There's still a lot of variability within that, even if we were sticking to Western, right? And for all of those characteristics, right, there's still different things you could be focusing on in different ways you might expect them to affect human behavior, psychology, physiology. So I agree with you about it could be better. I hope, at least, our stab at coming up with characteristics was trying to get at them more specific, but even with ours, I'm certain, that there's ways that what we have could be improved upon, and those might not be the best characteristics to be using. Point well taken.
Lucas, I'm wondering if Dr. Graves, do you have more that you want, those other two questions I think you
I'm
posed?
trying to see.
Yeah, there are more comments than questions. On the one about birth control, for example, could actually increase an individual's fitness depending upon whether it led to superior survivorship of offspring in a number of ways. So it's not, birth control isn't simply decreasing fitness.
It's true. And I think also when you think about how, depending on the society you're in our modern environment, the types and amount of investment that you need to do for children to be competitive, right? So this is something that's come up a lot when I've talked with people about this concept of evolutionary mismatches. For your, children to do well in some cultures, right? The amount of effort and investment you need to do means you can only have a certain number of them, right? And so they're, to the extent that we're trying to assess fitness just by, number of offspring versus sort of the quality there, and then their ability to go on and have kids, right? Fewer might be what's necessary because of that investment that's required. So it sort of dovetails with that point there.
I think Ruth Mace is the next.
I think Ruth was piggybacking on an earlier comment.
Okay, right.
Yeah, from Dr. Graves.
So Cynthia.
Is it in the chat here? Just high or low?
Yeah, I
weight?
can read a question,
Okay.
or if Cynthia wants to speak, I don't know.
So it could be either. So the question is high or low? I think if I'm reading it correctly, low mate mismatch associate with more or fewer surviving offspring. I think it depends, right? I think there's ways in which there's elements of evolutionary mismatch that could increase offspring, right? So improve fitness. So I think Viagra is an example of this, right? Somebody who, a very straightforward example, right? Somebody who might not be able to continue having offspring, a male, right, for physiological reasons, right? That could be overcome with modern medicine. But on the flip side, right, you could think of ways in which it might be impeding having offspring, right? And I think it just depends on the characteristic, right? And what we're hypothesizing about it. I think there's a cool paper that is looking at it's sort of like social media usage and really kind of like cell phone usage and some of that, and relationship formation. And they talk about how relationships, there's two sort of important processes in the formation of relationships. One is self-disclosure. So when you disclose to people and that helps build the relationship. And the other is that the person is responding to you. So this responsiveness back from them. And that's how trust and intimacy gets built, right? Is that you disclose and somebody's being responsive back. And so in this paper, they talk about how social media apps really take advantage of our motivation for these things. So people disclose a lot over those apps, right? They can share information about themselves. They feel like they're sharing with somebody. And then there's a lot of real low-cost ways people respond back. So they can hurt it, or they can, leave a one-off comment or something. But our psychology takes that in as, oh, I'm getting this responsiveness. And so they argue in that paper that this is really disrupting people's relationship formation processes, right? And that they're sort of tricked into thinking, I'm building these actual relationships, whether it's romantic or friend, when they aren't. And so something like that then could impede, right, ability to develop romantic relationships, have kids, things like that. So these different characteristics might have different impacts. And yeah, people can lie on social media in ways that they cannot face to face. The amount of deception, right, about one's own characteristics, one's own goals, all of those things, So reputation is something that is, historically seems to have been important, right, in mate selection, knowing what this person is like and how they've been in the group that you're living in. And our ability to know things about people's reputation and past is really limited by lots of mismatch characteristics. The fact that we're so relocatable, that there's so many of us, but also through these different ways that we meet people now, that we can be deceptive and we can lie more easily about it. And it's, the back and forth way this works, where people are motivated to be deceptive, but then also the technology helps us with that, right? So the filters, right? All these things that people are then motivated to use that, which then puts pressure on the technology creator companies to do better at that, right? And so the way the technology then plays into that could be, really aids in that ability to deceive. There's one technology. I don't disagree with you that if there's one technology in the 21st century that alien anthropologists will tie to the extinction of our species, it will be social media. I will not argue against that hypothesis.
We have a hand raised. Lucas. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh yeah, Ruth, please go on.
Oh, hi. I was just wondering if you can really, I know I agree with the idea of like looking at variability in behavior. I think that's one of the things as a behavioral ecologist, that's one of the things I always try to do. But I don't know whether it will really, I don't know whether it can help you really with your mismatch argument, just in the sense that one of the things we might assume is that if you're looking at variability in behavior, the way we're responding to that variability is some kind of evolved reaction norm. So that might be one way of thinking of it. So, and we also do understand that hunter-gatherer environments, for example, were extremely diverse. So are we actually getting any nearer? I mean, any nearer to looking at I totally approve of looking at variability, but is it going to help us solve the mismatch problem? If there is a mismatch problem, yeah.
I don't know. And I mean, it's a good point. And it's one that we've turned over, over a number of conversations I've had about this, is for something that's truly a mismatch, right? If it's, so it's outside that range of variability or a characteristic that it's just so novel, right? That it wouldn't then be picked up regardless of if you've got some sample diversity, right? That you're not going to see it, right? And I think that's a well taken point. I agree, and I don't have a solution to that. But that might, that in of itself might show you something, right? That we don't see any responding to this at all, or we see everybody responding the same way, right? That might tell you something then about that mismatch characteristic.
We have a question by Luz in the chat. He's asking about the proportion of Americans that are taking drugs for mental health versus people in no-industrialized nations, and if you feel this could be related to the mismatch.
Oh, I had not thought about this. I mean, so there's different parts of that, right? Which is what is causing mental health difficulties, to the extent that there are differences in America versus some other population, right? Or is it that that there's similar rates of whatever the mental health concern is, right? But we're treating it differently here, right? I don't know. So I think there could be a mismatch question in there, right? So if it's something on the end of, part of mental health, right, is that there's ups and downs, and that we have some evolved strategies, right? Or we have psychology for dealing with these things, or that sometimes it's a cue to something, right? So, you think about something like grief, right? Or depression that comes after losing somebody, right? That, might be part of the process of getting through that, is experiencing that, right? And part of the function, some have argued some of the functioning of grief is to be signaling for social support, right? That, by those, those, how you are when you're depressed from that or sad from that, or experiencing grief. And so if we're, then using a pharmacological something in there to impede any of that, right? Is that helpful or harmful? I don't know. But then there's that flip side of it, right? The extent to which anything related to our mental health, right, might be being caused in greater amounts by mismatch. With the social media example, I think there was some of that in the data that does come out already. I didn't touch on this as much, but I kind of framed it as, oh, these are potential mates, but there's been others who have talked about it with the potential sort of rivals, right, or competitors, right? You're seeing all these people, especially for teens, who are their similar age, maybe same gender or different, right? The extent to which they feel like they don't match up, right, can set people up on this spiral, right, of negative self-image and depression. And in that paper too, they talk about maybe this being related to eating disorders, especially in young women in countries like the US, where those seem to be on the rise, right? And how much is something that is a sort of like a mismatch problem, right? From the input that they're getting. So it's a little separate from talking about the drugs people are taking for mental health, but I think there's different pieces of that for the mental health question with mismatch that are interesting.
Dr. Graves?
Yeah, I mean, I got to chime in on the so-called mental health issue. I don't think people are in any way, excuse me, willingly taking these drugs to improve their mental health. There was a change in the way psychiatry dealt with mental health in the 1950s, which was associated with the development of powerful antipsychotic drugs. And that became a cultural meme, as it were, to displace the societal responsibility for taking care of people with mental illness and displacing it on the individual. And at the same time, becoming an extremely lucrative industry. So I would tend to agree that this is the sort of mismatch that Nessie talks about in his book with regard to the development of extremely powerful drugs, which traditional humans would never have had access to. In fact, on the issue of eating disorders, I literally saw a paper today on selection on polygenic traits that suggested at least one of them, anorexia nervosa, may actually have been, shows evidence for positive selection since the Neolithic. And I'll put this citation in the chat. But on the end of the day, these pharmaceutical products are an extreme example of evolutionary mismatch of the worst kind.
And I think another example that, as I was talking, I wish I'd remember this one. Postpartum depression, anxiety, psychosis is one of these things where you have a bunch of people who had a baby and haven't slept and are often very isolated in our modern environment. It looks not I shouldn't say modern environment, but for some women in some circumstances that they live in now, where that postpartum time, instead of there being lots of kin, lots of family, lots of people to help around, right? And no expectation of people having, or not expectation, but need for people to then leave and go back to work and things like that. It's such a different, such a mismatch problem, I think, that, postpartum period for women. And the solution often that's suggested is pharmacological, right? Because it's sort of an easier solution than, oh no, we need actually to put money and investment in having people come there and be there for you and help you. And then you have some financial support until you have to, and you don't have to go back to work, when your baby's 12 weeks old. So I think, to me, like, that is one of those prime examples also of thinking about mismatch and what's going on there. And it's, when you read at least the kind of way it's talked about, oh, it's because of the hormones, right? Because you're going through this big hormone shift, and hormones are just used as this, this bio whatever in this case, right? So that's why you need, we'll get you an antidepressant, we'll get you an anti-anxiety pill, right? Like that will help with this, right? Because it's a biological problem. So this is that biological solution that will help, ignoring all of these other factors that matter for the biology, right? That the fact that you're not sleeping, the fact that you're, having to go out or be away from, do these other things, the fact that you don't have the social support that can help with all of that. So I think it's one of those big examples there for thinking about mismatch as well, that hits on that, the mental health and the pharmacological solutions that are proposed for that.
Lucas, I think Cynthia is another one, and then thank you, Joe, for that reference in there. That's great.
Well, the point that I wanted to make was that polygenic risk scores that associate with a trait like anorexia nervosa may also associate with other traits that weren't measured. Just because this study found an association with anorexia doesn't mean that selection on that trait was what drove selection on that particular nucleotide or set of nucleotides.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, it could clearly be pleiotropy, but also, I mean, they did look at 870 polygenic traits. and only a few of them had evidences of strong positive selection. Anorexia nervosa being one, and the other was oh gosh, it's colon disorder. It's a very common disease that I should know the name of.
Well,
Inflammatory bowel disease.
Hmm. Oh, here Randy has a question. He probably has a more informed one than.
I wish it was a question. There's lots to talk about here, but you pushed my button by mentioning the polygenic scores for anorexia nervosa. There are a lot of people, and one particular, Cynthia Billick, has been pushing the idea that it actually is a metabolic disease because they have identified 4 loci that are related to metabolism that are associated with the risk of anorexia nervosa. And it's the best possible example of misguided modern genetics, because the total of variance that's accounted for by all the genes, even in a polygenic score, is 1.7%. And as other people have mentioned, there are all kinds of other ways that there's no selection for or against anorexia nervosa. The whole thing is just ridiculous. And we as evolutionary people have an opportunity to help set them straight and pointing out that that's not how natural selection works, creating selection for traits like anorexia nervosa. It also makes the other simplistic mistake of treating diseases as if they are adaptations. So back to the core questions for today, though. Thank you.
I'd say here, Randy.
So I think we're wrapping up this session. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Cari, for the presentation. It was really good, really nice to see your talks and contributions to our study of mismatch in evolutionary medicine. Johnny, do you want to add something?
If anybody has any kind of long-term or questions that haven't had a chance to get out, Cari is graciously offered that you can email her for questions later if they come up. Otherwise, we have maybe another opportunity right now quickly. Otherwise, thank you, everyone. This was great.
Thank you.
Cari.
I appreciate the opportunity and I really appreciated your comments. So thank you.
All right. And feel free to message Cari if you have any questions. But we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.